Today I would like to continue in our study of the minor prophets with the book of Micah. The name Micah is a shortened form of the Hebrew Micaiah, which means who is like Yah, or who is like God. God began utilizing Micah as a prophet several years after he started using the prophet Isaiah. They were then contemporaries into the reign of King Hezekiah of Judah. Therefore, the information God transmitted through Micah occurred roughly between 750 and possibly as late as 700 BC. Micah's earliest prophecies were given to him prior to the eclipse of the great material affluence that was being enjoyed and accumulated by both the northern and southern kingdoms. Their physical prosperity was the result of the peace and the security that was achieved during the long and stable reigns of Jeroboam II in the north and Uzziah in the south. During that period, all of the major trade routes that flowed through that area were under the control of both Israel and Judah. That is, all of the trade from Mesopotamia into Egypt. So there was a tremendous amount of commerce that was being enjoyed by both, and as a result, this was one of the reasons for the great prosperity. It was also during that period that a major societal upheaval occurred. In the agricultural society God established from the time Israel took possession of the Promised Land, land ownership was guaranteed to individuals. There was no really poor class of people in one respect because all had land. This kept the vast majority of the population tied to the land and thereby prevented the extremes of wealth or poverty which often occurs in urban populations. However, with the lure of easier wealth involving commerce found primarily in the great cities or the larger cities, we find that many of the people then began to and constantly migrated off the land. They were going to seek their riches, kind of like the California gold rush. They're going to go somewhere else to seek their riches rather than the harder work of working the land. The rich bought the land of those who desired to move into the cities, and they constantly that way increased their estates or the size of their estates, which in turn increased their wealth and increased their power. So the rich continued to get richer, and the poor continued to get poorer. Many used their wealth, that is, of the rich, used their wealth to bribe rulers and judges who subsequently helped the rich to take even more from the poorer classes. This created urban areas where wealth, luxury, and vice existed side by side with poverty, misery, and squalor, which is a description of most of the major cities of this world. I mean, that's what happens. People come together and, they either have to produce or they starve unless the government decides to give them welfare, which, again, most countries have done that, as we've seen, and that usually leads to the fall of the nation ultimately. Micah's later prophecies then came after the fall of the northern and southern kingdoms, or I should say the northern kingdom, during the reign of the southern kingdom's king Hezekiah. Micah's material is in three sections, easily discernible three sections. Chapters 1 and 2, chapters 3, 4, and 5, and then the third being chapters 6 and 7. Each section is a complete unit composed of an exhortation to listen to what is about to be said. Then there was a prophecy of doom or judgment that was given, and then that is followed by a prophecy of hope. Since the span of Micah's prophetic revelations occurred within the reigns of three kings, we find that in chapter 1, verse 1. We'll come to that in just a couple of seconds. But since his prophecies were given during those three kings' reigns, it's reasonable to assume that one of each of these three sections came during each of one of those three kings' reigns. That seems to be a logical deduction. The second section is connected with the reign of Hezekiah in Jeremiah chapter 26, verse 18. So the second section, chapters 3 through 5, came during the reign of Hezekiah. This means that the first and the third sections were given to Micah prior to the fall of the northern kingdom during the reigns of Jotham and Ahaz. Now, there are two reasons for this book. First of all, to show that the day of the Lord will be necessary. And again, that involves the failure of Israel. The failure of Israel to fulfill their duty, their responsibility, their role as an example to the other nations, we find in this particular book says is the reason the day of the Lord must come upon the earth. And secondly, this book is to emphasize the great mercy of God, which is the very emphasis established by the name of the prophet. Who is like God? Who is like God because of the favor, the mercy that He is willing to extend to those who, frankly, haven't done what they should have done? All right, then that brings us to chapter 1, verse 1. The word of the Lord that came to Micah of Moresheth in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, which he saw, or as the Revised English Bible translates, he received it in visions concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. Moresheth was a town in the territory of Judah located about 25 miles west-southwest of Jerusalem, between the highlands, which is where the city of Jerusalem lay, and the lowland area of the Philistine plain, where Philistia was located. So down in that area toward Gaza is the location. Like many other prophets, Micah received God's revelation through visions, as it's very clear here. It says, which he saw, or the Revised English Bible, received it in visions. The primary thrust of those revelations that Micah received concerned the whole of Israel and Israel's descendants. Not just Judah, but the northern kingdom's tribes as well. Verse 2, Hear, all you peoples, listen, O earth, and all that is in it. Let the Lord God be a witness against you, the Lord from His holy temple. So we find here that all nations are put on notice of the judgment that God will unleash upon all the earth, the whole world. Micah emphasizes that all that follows is testimony directly from God in heaven. It says, listen, let the Lord God be a witness. So all of this is the word of God, which He's received via vision. Verse 3, For behold, the Lord is coming out of His place. He will come down and tread on the high places of the earth. Now, God testifies through Micah that He will personally take charge of the judgment that He intends to bring against all nations. He is in charge. He is responsible. In Psalm 18 and in verse 7, we read, Then the earth shook and trembled. The foundations of the hills also quaked and were shaken because He was angry. Smoke went up from His nostrils and devouring fire from His mouth. Coals were kindled by it. He bowed the heavens also and came down with darkness under His feet. And He rode upon a cherub and flew. He flew upon the wings of the wind. So we find here that God will come down, literally. He takes personal charge. Also in Isaiah chapter 26. Isaiah 26 and verse 21. For behold, and again the context here is the time of the day of the Lord, as you read Isaiah chapter 26, but we come down to the final verse and it says, For behold, the Lord comes out of His place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity. The earth will also disclose her blood and will no more cover her slain. And so, again, we find here from what Micah says in verse 3 that God will come down. God will tread on the high places. God Himself is personally responsible for bringing on the day of the Lord. Now, verse 4, he goes on to explain what happens when God comes down. The mountains will melt under Him, and the valleys will split like wax before the fire, like waters poured down a steep place. Revised English Bible gives a little different twist on this. It says, At His touch, Mountains will dissolve like wax before fire. Valleys are torn open as when torrents pour down a hillside, like a waterfall. This verse refers to the effects caused by the events of the day of the Lord. It's primarily to be understood literally, depicting the effects of earthquakes and volcanic activity, as some scriptures clearly reveal. And again, a number of scriptures that back this up. One is in Jeremiah chapter 4. Jeremiah 4, verse 23. Jeremiah states, I beheld the earth, and indeed it was, as we've seen before in the Hebrew, tohu vabohu, which means, as it's translated in the New King James, without form and void, just like the earth is described in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. And the hills, they had no light, or the heavens had no light. I beheld the mountains, and indeed they trembled, and the hills moved back and forth. He's talking about literal events taking place on the earth. He's talking here about about earthquake activity for certain. I beheld the mountains, they trembled, the hills moved back and forth. I beheld, and indeed there was no man, and all the birds of the heavens had fled. I beheld, and indeed the fruitful land was a wilderness, and all its cities were broken down at the presence of the Lord by his fierce anger. So God's anger is responsible for bringing on the day of the Lord. Now, in Nahum chapter 1, back in Nahum, right after the book of Micah, Nahum chapter 1, verse 4, he rebukes the sea and makes it dry, a reference to God. All right, so he does things to the oceans, the seas, and dries up all the rivers, the fresh waters. Bashan and Carmel wither, and the flower of Lebanon wilts. Shows an absence of water. The mountains quake before him, and the hills melt. Hills melting, we're talking of volcanic activity. And the earth heaves at his presence. Yes, the world and all who dwell in it. So again, this helps us to understand what Micah is saying in verse 4. He's talking about literal events taking place upon this earth, major literal catastrophes. Now, as other scriptures disclose, this verse can also be understood metaphorically. That is, the mountains representing the major nations whose powers are as incapable of resisting God's presence as wax is in resisting a flame. Because as we know, as you put a flame close to wax, you hold a candle up and put a flame next to it, and it just melts away. There's no resistance, in other words. He's talking about there is literally no resistance. God is so powerful, you're not going to find resistance. It just is impossible from the physical ability that man has. The valleys represent men without power. Okay, that's what that would mean here in Micah. Now, in a related passage, back in Isaiah chapter 40, here valleys don't represent men without power, but rather men without vanity or men without pride, because here in Isaiah 40, verse 4, it says, every valley shall be exalted. This is metaphoric. Because it goes on to say, and every mountain and hill shall be made low. This is a reference to the nations, the major nations, the minor nations, that will be brought down from where they are, where they think they are anyway. The crooked places shall be made straight, the rough places smooth. All right, so this is metaphoric in Isaiah 40. In Isaiah chapter 66, Isaiah 66, verse 15, for behold, the Lord will come down with fire and with his chariots, like a whirlwind, to render his anger with fury and his rebuke with flames of fire. Again, getting back to verse 4, where it's talking about melting, just melting away. There will literally be fire. For by fire and his sword, by his sword, the Lord will judge all flesh, and the slain of the Lord shall be many. Also, Zechariah 14, verse 12. Zechariah 14, verse 12. And this shall be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the people who fought against Jerusalem. Their flesh shall dissolve while they stand on their feet, like wax melting. He says that their flesh will dissolve, like wax when you hold a flame to it. While they stand on their feet, their eyes shall dissolve in their sockets, their tongues shall dissolve in their mouths. This is the way the plague that comes from God is described against all of those armies that assemble against him at the time that Jesus Christ returns to fight, as described in Revelation chapter 19. Now again, as I said, even though a valley in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 4, represents one who is humble, here in Micah, valleys represent, or I should say can represent metaphorically, men without the cumulative power of the nations, but those who each of these men help, as they put all of their power together, become the power of the nations. But these individuals are those who refuse to repent. They refuse to submit to God, like the ones who will be slaughtered in the battle of the great day of God Almighty that we just read about in Zechariah, but we can also read in Revelation chapter 19. Revelation 19, verse 17, because here we find described what happens after the end of what is described in Zechariah 14, verse 12. Here in Revelation 19:17, then I saw an angel standing in the sun. He cried with a loud voice, saying to all the birds that fly in the midst of heaven, come and gather together for the supper of the great God, that you may eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of horses, and those who sit on them, and the flesh of all people, free and slave, both small and great. So those who are small, those who are without power, they will be destroyed. And so, again, verse 4 can be taken either literally or it can be taken metaphorically. Going on in Micah chapter 1, verse 5, all this, all that he's described, what is to happen, what is to take place on this earth in the day of the Lord, all this is for the transgression of Jacob and for the sins of the house of Israel. What is the transgression of Jacob? Is it not Samaria? And what are the high places of Judah? Are they not Jerusalem? Now, although each of these names, Jacob and Israel, could refer to the combined kingdoms of Israel and Judah, it's more likely, based upon the meanings of the names, that Jacob refers to the northern kingdom and Israel to the southern kingdom. Remember, Jacob means supplanter, or one who replaces, which is exactly what the northern kingdom was guilty of doing when the worship of God was replaced or supplanted with the worship of Baal by Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, that we're told about after the kingdom split in the days of Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. Israel, on the other hand, means prevailer with God, which refers to the continuation of the preservation of the worship of God by the southern kingdom. At least the southern kingdoms. The temple was still standing. There was still a Levitical priesthood in operation. The scrolls of Moses, of David, those things were preserved. That's where the Holy Scripture was being preserved. So the continuation was there, and so they were still, in that sense, prevailing with God at this point in time. Now, the blame for the continuation of the transgression of the northern kingdom was attributed to its capital city, Samaria. What it says. What's the transgression of Jacob? What is it? It's Samaria. It's the capital city. It's where the leadership of the nation resided. The sins of the southern kingdom are directly linked to the high places of pagan worship. Because it says, what are the high places of Judah? Those were, again, you go back to 2 Kings, for instance, chapter 12, verse 3, and there you read about the high places where pagan worship was carried out, where the groves were established, the Asherah were erected. And again, those high places lured the majority of the southern kingdom away from God. So even the southern kingdom, even though they were preserving the truth, they were preserving the Word, they were in their lives doing something else. The accountability for the allowance of the continuation of those sins was assigned to the leadership in the capital city of Jerusalem, just like the sins of the northern kingdom were assigned to Samaria, its capital. God places the blame for the need of the day of the Lord in this verse on the failure of the tribes of Israel to fulfill the responsibility they agreed to perform in the covenant that they made with him at Mount Sinai. God says, this is the reason. Because you have failed, it's necessary for this to happen. Because Israel did not keep its word to obey God, it never became the kingdom of priests and the holy nation that God had intended it to be. Remember Exodus chapter 19, verse 6? You are to be a kingdom of priests or a holy nation to me. Israel never became that. That was what they were supposed to be, but they never became that. As a result, the rest of the nations never had the right example to follow, and they were never led as a result to the true God. In fact, Israel did just the opposite. By their conduct, by their desire. Well, we don't want God to rule over us. We want a king like everybody else. They wanted what the world had. By their conduct, they made God's name a mockery among the nations. Notice in Ezekiel chapter 36. Ezekiel 36 and in verse 17. Son of man, God tells Ezekiel, when the house of Israel dwelt in their own land, they defiled it by their own ways and deeds. To me, their way was like the uncleanness of a woman in her customary impurity. Therefore I poured out my fury on them for the blood they had shed on the land, and for their idols with which they had defiled it. So I scattered them among the nations, and they were dispersed throughout the countries. I judged them according to their ways and their deeds. When they came to the nations, that is, when they left that land, by force, of course, when they came to the nations, wherever they went, they profaned my name. When they said of them, that is, when those people living wherever Israel went, when they said of them, these are the people of the Lord, and yet they have gone out of his land. What God is saying here, in other words, God was viewed because of what happened, because he had to kick them out of the land. The way the world perceived it is that God was viewed as a weak God, incapable of providing for those who worshiped him. Well, he couldn't even protect them. He couldn't even keep them in the land. What a weak God. And so God was made out to be a weakling to the nations, and they didn't want to follow a weakling. So Israel was responsible for that. Verse 6, the Revised English Bible translates, I shall reduce Samaria to a ruin in the open country, a place for planting vines, or a vineyard, the New King James has. I shall hurl her stones into the valley and lay bare her foundations. The Assyrians heavily damaged Samaria when the northern kingdom was overthrown in 721 BC by Sargon II. Sargon II was the one who was able to finally cart off the remainder of the northern tribes of Israel. But Sargon II claimed, after he had done so, that he rebuilt the city better than it was before he conquered it. So he didn't demolish it like this. In fact, it was not until 107 BC, 107 BC, in the days of the Hasmonean ruler John Hyrcanus, that the destruction prophesied here was finally accomplished. In describing the extent of that event, of the destruction of John Hyrcanus, Josephus writes about Hyrcanus in Antiquities of the Jews, book 13, chapter 10, paragraph 3. Josephus states that Hyrcanus demolished it entirely, that is, the city of Samaria. He took away the very marks that there had ever been such a city there. So he was the one responsible for pushing the stones of the city, the walls of the city, down into the valley, because it was built on top of a hill. According to 1 Kings 16:24, Omri went in and bought the hill of Samaria, and there he built the city of Samaria. But it was on top of a hill, and so it could, the stones could be shoved down into the valley. which was what happened in Hyrcanus' day, and as a result, the hilltop was left covered with nothing more than dirt. And so that soil then was utilized for cultivation for a while before another town was later built on top of it. But that was when God's prophecy finally came true. Now, verse 7, the New International has, all her idols will be broken to pieces. All her temple gifts will be burned with fire. I will destroy all her images. Now, the breaking of her idols was an indictment against Israel for trusting in anything other than God. How can you have idols? If you trust in God, you don't need an idol. Well, they didn't trust God, so they had their idols. The Assyrians also stripped the precious metals from the idols that were plated, and many of them were. They were wood underneath, and they were plated with precious metals, and so the Assyrians stripped all the precious metal off and then burned the wood underneath. Again, another indictment that those idols had no power of themselves. Verse 7 goes on in the New International, since she gathered her gifts from the wages of prostitutes, as the wages of prostitutes, they will again be used. The wealth accumulated by the northern kingdom during the time of its harlotry with idols would be taken by the Assyrians back to Assyria, and there much of it would be offered in the temples of their idols. And so that metal, some of it would be beaten back into the shapes and sizes of the idols of the Assyrians. So this is what he's talking about. Verse 8, the Tanakh translates, because of this, I will lament and wail, Micah says. Because of this, what he sees, Micah writes, I will go stripped and naked. I will lament as sadly as the jackals, as mournfully as the ostriches. Other translations have wolf instead of jackal, desert owl in place of ostriches. But all of those animals make weird screeching noises. And this is what Micah is talking about here. This was his reaction to what he had seen in this vision of what God was going to do. He felt he needed to express his sorrow as fully as possible by wearing no shoes and virtually no clothing. The word naked here can mean either, not sufficient clothing, or it can mean naked, completely unclothed. So whatever it is kind of irrelevant here, but he went into mourning. This was a public display of mourning and would serve as a warning to his people of God's coming judgment because of the sin, because of what they had done, because of their failure to keep the covenant. Verse 9, the Tanakh goes on, for her wound is incurable. It has reached Judah. Her wound, the wound of Samaria, is incurable. It has reached Judah. It has spread to the gate of my people, to Jerusalem. The verdict of God on the northern kingdom was comparable to an incurable wound. That is, the judgment was irreversible. There was nothing at that point in time when Micah prophesied that could change the verdict that God had made. There was no way. Incurable, irreversible. The southern kingdom was about to be sentenced to the same judgment. However, it would not become incurable until the reign of Manasseh, because it was in Manasseh's reign, we're told in 2 Kings chapter 23, verses 23 and 24, that God says, okay, that's it. I'm going to let things go on for a while, but forget it. This kingdom will not stand. And of course, he was about to destroy it. Josiah, in Josiah's day, because of Josiah, he allowed it to continue until the days of his sons. In fact, the Assyrians, when it says here that the wound, the judgment has come all the way to the gate of Jerusalem, the Assyrians came against Jerusalem during the days of Hezekiah. But due to Hezekiah's relationship with God, the city and the kingdom were spared. You can go back and read that in 2 Kings chapter 19. We all know what happened at that point in time. Hezekiah went, he took the letter that he had gotten from Rabshakeh and he laid it down and he prayed before God, and went to Isaiah. All of these things took place then. And God spared the kingdom in Hezekiah's day. Prior to and leading up to that event, the army of Assyria, led by its king Sennacherib, marched through many towns of Judah on its way to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was besieged in Hezekiah's day. Remember, and then Hezekiah prayed, and then God destroyed 180,000 Assyrian soldiers outside the gates. And so they got there, but they did damage on the way, because they had to come through populated parts of the southern kingdom. In fact, the next 6 verses, beginning in verse 10, the next 6 verses list some of the towns which were to experience the brunt of that particular invasion. Each of the towns destined for judgment are identified with a phrase that is a play on the meaning of its name. Now, there are 12 towns mentioned here, or 12 towns or cities, because Jerusalem is included as well, where the Assyrians actually did damage. Verse 10, New International translates, "Tell it not in Gath, weep not at all." The phrase, "tell it not in Gath," you can go back to 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 20, and you will find that that phrase was used by David. It was a command of David issued after the death of Saul. And David said, don't tell it in Gath. In other words, he did not want the enemy of Israel to know about the death of Saul. He wanted them to remain in ignorance of that particular event. And apparently this became kind of a term that was used among the people about keeping certain things quiet. Tell it not in Gath. However, Gath had been conquered during the early part of King Uzziah's reign and was controlled by Judah at the time of the Assyrian invasion, according to 2 Chronicles chapter 26. So, the original emphasis of the expression that David began was no longer valid. Since Gath, the name Gath literally means tell it. Gath means tell it. Tell it. The wordplay indicates, because it says tell it not in tell it, is what it's saying here. Tell it not in tell it. And so it indicates that those who were in Gath, the inhabitants of Gath, were left speechless and numbed by the destruction that that city would suffer. Tell it not. In other words, they're going to be speechless. How bad things become when the Assyrians invade their town. It says, in Beth Ophrah, roll in the dust. In Beth, remember Beth means house or house of. Beth means house of. Bethlehem means house of bread. Here, Beth Ophrah means house of dust. Ophrah is dust. So here is the house of dust. And it says, in the house of Ophrah, roll in the dust. So in the house of dust, roll in the dust. One form of mourning that we find throughout the Scripture, and still even evident today in some parts of the Middle East and North Africa, is to sit in dust or ashes and to throw it over one's head. To roll in the dust would signify significant, extensive mourning. If you're going to roll in it, that's got to be some pretty bad mourning. So things are going to be really bad for the house of Ophrah. Verse 11, pass on in nakedness and shame, you who live in Shaphir. Now, Shaphir means beautiful and pleasant. And yet here we're told that those in Shaphir are to pass on in nakedness and shame. That is, its inhabitants would be treated the opposite of its name. They would be humiliated. They would be degraded instead of being beautiful and pleasant. And then he goes on to say here in verse 11, those who live in Zaanannim will not come out. Now, Zaanannim means come out. So those in come out will not come out. But then they would have no reason to come out and greet those who were intent on coming to the town to destroy it, which is what the Assyrians would do. And then he has here in the latter part of verse 11, Beth Azel. Beth, house of Azel. That means house that is near. House that is near. House that is near is in mourning. Its protection, or its place to stand, or its support, other translations have, its support is taken from you. Now, since the house that is near, you would suppose that you could rely on the house that is near for some help. But due to its own suffering, though it was close enough to provide Zeanan some help, it could not provide Zeanan help, could not provide it any protection because of what it too would suffer. Verse 12, the Revised English Bible has, the people of Marath are in the depths of despair, for disaster from the Lord has come down to the very gate of Jerusalem. Marath means bitternesses. Bitternesses. Its inhabitants would be in hopeless despair when the report came that the Assyrians had reached the vicinity of Jerusalem. And so the people of bitternesses were in the depths of bitterness because of what they heard. They could see that Jerusalem was about to be overthrown. Of course, that was before God stepped in and killed the army of the Assyrians. Verse 13, Revised English Bible has, you people of Lachish, who first led the daughter of Zion into sin. The New King James has here, after Lachish, she was the beginning of sin to the daughter of Zion. You people of Lachish, harness the steeds to the chariots. In you, the crimes or transgressions, New King James has, or rebellious acts, the New American Standard has, of Israel are to be found. So in you, the transgressions or rebellious acts of Israel are to be found. That is in the city of Lachish, which was in the southern kingdom. Now, Lachish, the word Lachish, sounds a lot like the Hebrew word for team or group. Very similar in sound. Despite being one of the most heavily fortified cities in all of Judah, as Lachish was, it was a heavily fortified militarized city, Lachish was conquered by Sennacherib after a very lengthy siege, according to 2 Chronicles 32, verse 9. So it was a very powerful city. The pride of its inhabitants caused them to think that the city was indestructible. Well, we have such high walls and heavily fortified, and we have all of the chariots that Solomon had placed there. And so, that it was a very, they had a lot that they could think that they could trust in. And so they foolishly, because of their trust in the walls of the city, they remained within its walls, when the correct decision, according to what Micah says here, the correct decision should have been to flee as quickly as possible with the great horses and chariots that they had at their disposal. But they didn't. They didn't run. They didn't turn to the teams or the groups of chariots and horses. Now, there's no scriptural elaboration on how Lachish became the first city in Judah to succumb to the sin of idolatry that the northern kingdom had succumbed to. We have nothing in the Scripture that we can go to. However, due to the pride of its inhabitants, which led them to trust in what they could construct with their own hands, that is, the walls of the city of Lachish, rather than putting their trust in God, they were already mentally they were already prepared to replace God with idols. Because, we're going to trust in the walls rather than trusting in God, like Hezekiah did, and the walls of the city weren't breached. But no, the people of Lachish trusted in their walls, and they weren't importuning God. And so they turned apparently to idolatry. Now, that event of turning to the idolatry of the northern kingdom must have happened after Solomon established Lachish as one of his fortress or fortified cities and stocked it with chariots, because we're told in 1 Kings chapter 10 and verse 26, 1 Kings 10:26, that Lachish became one of the chariot cities. And so Solomon stocked it. It was south of Jerusalem, and that's where its location was. That must have occurred at that point, because that was prior to the error of Solomon taking pagan wives and delving into their idolatries, which is mentioned then in 1 Kings chapter 11, because then he built high places for his wives. He built temples for idolatry right there around Jerusalem. And so what Lachish did preempted it. They did it before Solomon was responsible for doing it right there in Jerusalem itself. All right, verse 14. Therefore, Revised English Bible again, therefore you must give parting gifts to Moresheth Gath. Now, Moresheth means inheritance. Moresheth Gath, the inheritance of Gath. It has Moresheth has a very similar sound to the Hebrew word that means betrothed. Since a bride was given a dowry as a gift from her father when she left the family through marriage, this town called Moresheth, which means inheritance, okay, that's what it means inheritance, since this town was close to and under the jurisdiction of Gath, it was to be given, if you will, as an inheritance to the Assyrians without a struggle. In other words, there was no resistance at Moresheth Gath. The citizens of Gath remained within its walls. They did not come out to try to defend that town. Then it goes on here in verse 14, Beth Akzib, house of Akzib, has betrayed the kings of Israel. It betrayed the kings of Israel. The Tanakh translates Beth Akzib are to the kings of Israel like a spring that fails. The word Akzib means lie. Akzib is lie. That was a name that was derived from the streams that ran only during the winter months in that part of Israel. They dried up whenever water was most needed in the summertime when there were crops that needed the water. So they dried up. In the wintertime, people would come, wow, look at all the water. We could grow this, that, and the other. And then, they might till the ground and whatever. And then when the water is really needed for irrigation, there is none coming down the streams. They're winter only, they're runoff. The town called House of Lies, or Beth Akzib, was one of the towns that was appointed to Judah when the land was divided in the days of Joshua. Back in Joshua 15 and verse 44, you will find that Akzib became one of the towns of Judah. So it had been under Jewish control by this point in time for over 600 years. That's a long time, 600 years. Yet despite the seeming permanence of that particular city, like the streams from which it received its name, at the time when it was sought for help, when it was really needed, it provided no resistance to the Assyrian invaders. Verse 15, New Revised Standard has, I will again bring a conqueror or an heir, the New King James has. The New American Standard has, one who takes possession upon you, inhabitants of Mareshah. Now, Mareshah comes from a root Hebrew word meaning to possess. The word conqueror in the New Revised Standard translation here is translated from a related form of the same root with the same or a very similar sound. So, like Mareshah, it's very, very close to Mareshah, the pronunciation. So Mareshah in the Hebrew, which again, we can't see this. If we could read Hebrew and understand Hebrew, it would be a lot more, it would be a lot easier to see some of these things. The prophecy states here that the town named Possessor, Mareshah, the town named Possessor or Mareshah, would be possessed or inherited by another that was appointed by God. And of course, the Assyrians were appointed by God to come down and to do this. He goes on here in verse 15 to say that the glory of Israel shall come to, Revised English Bible has, will be hidden in Adullam. Now, Moffat has here in the latter part of this that and Israel's pomp shall perish utterly. Israel's pomp shall perish utterly. Although I believe here that the New Revised Standard is better. The glory of Israel could refer generally to the people of the southern kingdom, or specifically, it could refer to the nobility, those of the ruling class. Either one would seek to hide from those who invaded the land. If they could somehow escape and go somewhere to hide, they would have gone there, because Adullam, that area, was a place of caves. Adullam was where David went and hid from Saul in the caves, back in 1 Samuel chapter 22. This last of the 12 towns mentioned in this section, like the first one, Gath, remember, was the first one, and now we come to Adullam. Both of these played an integral part in David's life. Both bring to mind two major times of sadness in the life of David, because he was sad at the time that Saul and Jonathan were killed, and he was sad that he had to flee from Saul in order to hide in Adullam. All right, now, verse 16, the New International has, "Shave your heads in mourning for the children in whom you delight. Make yourselves as bald as the vulture, for they will go from you into exile." This is a metaphorical instruction to the northern and southern kingdoms to prepare for the coming exiles of their inhabitants. Both the northern and southern kingdom, we're going to see all of their people taken out of the land, stripped away from the kingdom. Since they were both indulging in pagan practices such as shaving the head in mourning, we read about that back in Deuteronomy chapter 14, where God said, don't do it. That's what the pagans do. You don't do that. You don't do things that the pagans do. And that's what they do to mourn. And because of that, God sarcastically here instructs them, go ahead, if you're going to shave your head in mourning, make sure you get every bit of it. Do a thorough job of it, because you are going to mourn. That's what he's telling, metaphorically, the kingdoms of Judah and Israel. Verse 1, chapter 2. Woe, New International, woe to those who plan iniquity, to those who plot evil on their beds. At morning's light they carry it out, because it is in their power to do it. God now reveals the reason the pronounced judgments must be completed. All of the judgments that he's just said must come. This is why it has to happen. The values and goals of the people were contrary to the application of his law of love that he gave Israel in the covenant at Sinai. The code of morality that he gave them at Sinai was being completely ignored as they attempted to justify their selfish desires. Remember what God instructed them as part of the Sinai covenant? Back in Leviticus chapter 19. Leviticus 19, verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to all the congregation of the children of Israel, and say to them, you shall be holy." You're to be holy. You're to be different than the rest of the world, in essence. You're to be like me, God says. For I, the Lord your God, am holy. That's the kind of conduct that you're to exhibit. Down in verse 18, notice what he says. You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The royal law, James calls it, back in James. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. That's what God expected of them. But that's not what we read here. You who plan iniquity, you who plot evil, you carry it out. That doesn't sound like what God says here as part of the covenant. These people did not sin by accident. They didn't sin in ignorance. They were guilty of premeditation. Even during leisure time, he tells us, they were focused on themselves. When did they ever think of anybody else? When did they ever think of their neighbor? The only way they thought of their neighbor was what they could get. Their desires and how to get more for themselves by taking what belonged to their neighbors. That's what was on their mind. Verse 2. Tanakh goes on, they covet fields and seize them, houses and take them away. They defraud men of their homes and people of their land, or the New King James has, of their inheritance. Because again, remember the land was given by inheritance, but that was even being defrauded. So that land that was to be passed on or restored at the end of a Jubilee cycle wasn't being restored. They were gobbling up and taking whatever. Since they were obsessed with acquisition for themselves and had no regard for the needs of others, they didn't hesitate to use deceit and the threat of violence to achieve their selfish objectives. Whatever it took. Means, the end justified the means. That's what the way they looked at it. And what the end was, they wanted it. They wanted possession. They wanted to acquire. Verse 3, the Revised English Bible states, "Therefore, these are the words of the Lord. I am planning disaster for this nation," or against this family, New King James has. "A yoke which you cannot remove from your necks. You will not walk haughtily or erect," the Tanakh translates, "for the hour of disaster will have come." Those who showed no mercy. That is, they showed no mercy to anyone else. And they showed no mercy by taking away the very basic needs of other people. Those people who do that, God says, will be shown no mercy when all they have will be taken away from them, and they themselves are forced to relocate. They took land from others, their land will be taken. They took wealth from others, their wealth will be stripped from them. The yoke here that's mentioned refers to the certainty of their being led away as captives. The yoke, like putting a yoke on oxen or a team of horses. That yoke is there because you are going to be directed in whatever way those who put the yoke on you want to go. And they would be led out of the land. Verse 4, the New Revised Standard has, "On that day, they," that is, Israel's captors, "they shall take up a taunt song against you and wail with bitter lamentation." That is, they're going to imitate their captives. All right, the Assyrians in the north, the Babylonians later on in the south. This would be what would happen. "And they will say," quoting the Israelites that were being taken, "We are utterly ruined. The Lord," or He. Lord doesn't appear in the King James or New King James, it just says He. "He alters the inheritance of my people. How He removes it from me. Among our captors He parcels out our fields." Israel's captors will use these very phrases, the phrases that will be uttered by their captives in order to taunt them, as they are transported out of the land. The Israelites will bemoan the destruction they're forced to suffer, having their land taken from them, having their land given to others, because that's what we see. We're utterly ruined. That's what they are going to say, and it's going to be taunted back. "The Lord alters," or "He alters the inheritance of my people." Well, God promised us this, and He takes it from us, and He gives it to someone else. Notice, every case, they are blaming God here. They blame God rather than admit they are the ones at fault. They are the ones that brought these conditions on themselves by disregarding God's law and committing sin. It's God's fault. God hasn't been faithful to us of all things, but that's exactly, this is what the Assyrians, this is what the Babylonians would taunt back at them. Verse 5, New International, "Therefore you will have no one in the assembly of the Lord to divide the land by lot." Now, dividing the land by lot was the method that Joshua used at the time that the land of Israel was to be apportioned to the 12 tribes. That's back in Joshua chapter 14, first part of chapter 14. Once the tribes were expelled from the land, tribal governance ceased, and non-Israelites took possession of the land. That's what this is talking about. You'll have no one in the assembly of the Lord because they're not going to be in control any longer. Those who have come in and captured the territory will then be in control. Verse 6, New International says, do not prophesy, their prophets say, that is the prophets of the northern and southern kingdom. The prophets that we call false prophets, they're the ones who say, do not prophesy. Do not prophesy about these things. Disgrace will not overtake us. The false prophets wanted Micah silenced. Micah, shut your mouth. They wanted him silenced because the message of God which he brought was condemnatory of the very people that were giving them support. Who supported the false prophets? Well, the ones that the false prophets said smooth things to. That's who supported them. They then contradicted Micah's message, claiming that all would be well for the nation. Disgrace will not overtake us. Don't believe what Micah says. That's not going to happen. Verse 7, New Revised Standard has, should this be said, O house of Jacob? Is the Lord's patience exhausted? This is what the prophets, false prophets, were saying. Is the Lord's patience exhausted? Are these His doings? The New International translates that. Is the Spirit of the Lord angry? Does He do such things? So Micah responds to the false prophets. He challenges their demand to cease delivering God's message of coming calamity and their claim that only good lay in store for the nation. Micah says, should this be said? Is this really something that you should be telling the people? You see, because they were the descendants of Jacob, they believed, like later on when we come to Jesus' time, and the people say, well, do we not have Abraham as our father? Well, none of this that you're saying will pertain to us because we've got lineage, we've got genealogy, we can trust in our lineage. We can trust in our genealogy because there are promises that God made to our ancestors and made to Abraham. So we are certain that what you're saying doesn't apply to us. It applies to everybody else, but doesn't apply to us. And here, these people, those of the northern kingdom, even the southern kingdom, they believed that their lineage guaranteed their continuation on the land. The false prophets were saying that because they would use the Scripture, if you will. They would go back and, God promised. He promised it would be the land of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and it would to their descendants forever. They leave out the part to where there is condition here. These questions that they posed indicated very clearly, is the Lord's patience exalted? Are these His doings? These things that you're saying, Micah? Is this possible? They believed that God's favor was unconditional toward them. Verse 7 goes on in the latter part. Do not my words do good to one who walks uprightly? Now Micah says that, but this is what God says. Do not my words do good to one who walks uprightly? Micah responds here that the false prophets were wrong. They were dead wrong. God's favor is conditional. It is not unconditional. It only continues if the people with whom He has made a covenant are faithful in fulfilling that covenant. They must do their part. Those who do what they have promised God that they would do, on the other hand, they have nothing to fear. That's what He says. Do not my words do good to one who walks uprightly? That is, God says, if you're doing what's right, you don't have to worry about a thing. I'm going to take care of you. But you got to be doing it God's way. We've got to be walking uprightly. We've got to be keeping our end of the covenant. Verse 8, Revised English Bible. But you are not my people. God says, you're not my army. You are lo ami. Remember, back in Hosea, we covered lo ami. Ami is people, or my people, and lo means no, not, or not. Not my people. You are lo ami, God calls the northern kingdom. And here He says, you are not my people. You rise up as my enemy to my face, God says through Micah. to strip the cloaks from travelers who felt safe or from men returning from the battle. God emphatically states He is under no obligation to show them favor because rather than obeying the covenant and being His people, they had become enemies by blatantly disobeying the covenant, by blatantly disobeying Him. Rather than yielding to the ordinance of returning the outer cloak, this is what he uses as an example. Rather than just yielding to that ordinance, you are to return the outer cloak to a debtor every evening. Exodus chapter 22 and in verse 26. If someone has borrowed something, then they are to give you some pledge, the outer cloak. But you've got to always give it back in the evening so that the person would have it. Usually it's a poor person. They need it for covering from the cool of the night. So you have to give it back. That's what the law required. But they ignored this very simple ordinance. They treated the poor who were in their debt and others in need as enemies that needed to be spoiled. And rather than give the cloak back once they had it in their possession, they kept it. They didn't do what they were supposed to do. These selfish extortioners are condemned by God for being guilty of highway robberies. This is like travelers that feel safe that are walking through, or men returning from battle. And you take what you can from them. You're highway robbers, he calls them. Verse 9, the New International states, "You drive the women of my people from their pleasant homes. You take away my blessing or my glory from their children forever." New King James has glory. The manner in which the poor were treated was bad enough, as he's already shown. Their cloaks were taken from them. But the way widows were treated was even worse. God condemned the wicked covenant breakers for stripping the widows of what was theirs by inheritance. What was theirs by inheritance? The blessing of land ownership. And the dwellings that were built on that land, it belonged to them. The land stayed in the family. It could be leased out, as we know, in a Jubilee cycle, but at the end of the Jubilee, it had to be returned. And it could only be leased for what time that, a reasonable amount could be earned from the land. But the land was theirs. It belonged to the widows. So they could be taken care of. Something happened. Women, if their husbands were killed or died or whatever. And so that was being taken from them. You take my blessing. You take the inheritance that I have given to all of the tribes. Take it away from them. Another blessing that God apportioned to the widows and their children, that is, we look at those who were fatherless, those who had lost their parents even, that they were guaranteed the tithe of the third year, the third tithe. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 28 and 29. To the widows and the orphans, the third tithe was to be given. And that may, from what this says, and based upon everything else, they probably weren't doing it by this point in time. They certainly weren't doing some of the other things they were supposed to do. They weren't even keeping the feast as it was supposed to be, as God initially told Israel to keep it. And so, why would they do this? I mean, they were all worshiping false gods and idols and everything else, especially in the northern kingdom by this point in time. And so, even the third tithe may have been denied them, and that was be a blessing from God to help them in their time of hardship. Verse 10, New International goes on, "Get up, go away. This is not your resting place," or this is not your rest, the New King James has, "because it is defiled, it is ruined beyond all remedy." The promised land was to be the place of rest for Israel. After 40 years of wandering, it was to be their place of rest. Deuteronomy 12, verse 9. It was to be the rest for Israel based on their continuance in keeping the terms of the covenant that they had made with God at Mount Sinai. But there were strings attached. The strings were continuance. They were warned that failure to keep the covenant would produce defilement, which would result in their being expelled from the land just like nations who had been there before them. Notice in Leviticus chapter 18 and in verse 24. Leviticus 18, verse 24. Do not defile yourselves with any of these things. Now, just prior to this, he talks about all kinds of abominable sexual practices, including bestiality, homosexuality, and all the rest. I mean, God is very clear that this is not right, regardless of how humans like to reason in Hollywood and the government and wherever else. God says no. God says, don't defile yourself in any of these things, for by all these the nations are defiled. So this nation is defiled in that way today. Just one of the many ways, which I am casting out before you. Now I threw others out because they did it before you were here. For the land is defiled, therefore I visit the punishment of its iniquity upon it. And the land vomits out its inhabitants. You know, the land itself gets sick of these things. He's talking metaphorically. It's like there's something putrid in the stomach of the land, and it wants to vomit it out and get it off. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not commit any of these abominations, either any of your own nation or any stranger who sojourns among you. In other words, they come into your land, they've got to do things the way it's supposed to be done in this land. Not what they want to do, not things they want to keep as their tradition. God says they come here, they're going to do it this way or they're not welcome. For all these abominations the men of the land have done who were before you, and thus the land is defiled. Lest the land vomit you out also when you defile it, as it vomited out the nations that were before you. For whoever commits any of these abominations, the persons who commit them, shall be cut off from among their people. Therefore you shall keep my ordinance, so that you do not commit any of these abominable customs which were committed before you, and that you do not defile yourselves by them. I am the Lord your God. This is a reminder. Who's telling you this? God says, I am the Lord. That's all the authority that's necessary. God tells them to back this up. Now, verse 11, New International, chapter 2. Micah chapter 2, verse 11, New International. If a liar and deceiver comes and says, I will prophesy to you plenty of wine and beer, he would be just the prophet for this people. Boy, he's right. He's spot on. Moffat translates it very similar. The prophet for such folk, that is, those who are defiling the land, who are just turning their nose up at God, the prophet for such folk would be some empty fellow and a liar who promised to prophesy of wine and spirits. The message God sent through Micah was unacceptable to those who only wanted to hear smooth things or things to make them feel good about themselves. Well, we just want to feel good about ourselves. We want to be patted on the head and told us and be told how good we are and how pleased God is with us. That's what we want to hear. Like Israel of old, the New Testament church also has had its share of those who want to hear things that God isn't saying to them. Because they don't want to hear what God has to say. They want to hear something else. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, 2 Timothy 4, verse 2, notice what Timothy is told by Paul. Preach the word. Now, that's pretty straightforward. Preach the word. That's what we're trying to do today. We're preaching the word, at least what God said through Micah. Okay, so preach the word. Be ready in season, out of season, convince, rebuke, exhort, with all long-suffering and teaching. Okay, well, that's what we want. That's what we want. This is what's required for salvation. It's what we need. What do we need to know? What do we need to change? It's not, tell them what they want to hear. Make them feel good about themselves. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires. Because they have itching ears, they will heap up for themselves teachers, and they will turn their ears away from the truth and be turned aside to fables. Now that's happened in our day and time. It's happened in the history of the church throughout. Paul talks about people who turned away from solid doctrine. They turned away from the resurrection. They turned away from a number of things. And we're warned in all of the material about the various eras of the church, things that they needed to look out for in their day and time. For us today, we need to look out for basically all of it. But God says of Laodicea, you're making me sick, kind of like the land of Israel was feeling at the time that they were finally vomited out the northern kingdom and then later vomited out the southern. He says, you know what? Your attitude isn't right. You're not right. You're wrong. You can't control yourself like you need to. You can't control your tongue. You can't control base desires and desires to get even and to hold grudges and do these kind of things that we just read earlier before. God says, even told Israel, don't begrudge, don't hold grudges, don't do these things. But people do and just feel real good about themselves, pat themselves on the back. They're just so good, so righteous, so wonderful. Turn to fables. This verse concludes the first section of prophetic doom. What follows now in verse 12 is a prophecy of hope. So note, verse 12 from the New International, I will surely gather all of you, O Jacob. I will surely bring together the remnant, or the New Revised Standard says, the survivors of Israel. I will bring them together like sheep in a pen, like a flock in its pasture. The place will throng with people. Despite the need for God to remove Israel from the land due to their failure to perform the terms of the Sinai covenant, God at a future time will extend mercy to Israel. He will show them favor once again and honor the promise that He made to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, as well as to the descendants of Jacob before the death of Moses. God told that generation, just before Moses died, some very important instruction. And He told them, you know what, you're going to get kicked out of the land. I'm going to bring you back. Let's note this back in Deuteronomy chapter 30. Because they were warned up front. And yet, for some reason, the false prophets in Micah's day and in Jeremiah's day never seemed to see this. And it was available to them because it was the books of Moses. Deuteronomy 30, verse 1. Now it shall come to pass, when all these things come upon you, that is, everything that He said up to this point, beginning basically back the beginning of the book, but especially beginning in chapter 28, where He gives the blessings and then follows that by giving a list of cursings that would occur to the people based upon either doing it God's way or not doing it God's way, obeying or disobeying. And so He says, when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse, which I have set before you, and you call them to mind, you're going to, once all these things happen, you're going to call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God drives you, and you return to the Lord. That is, you turn back to the Lord. Now, when does that happen? Well, that does not happen until the close of the trumpet plagues. And we see back in Revelation, I think chapter 11, where those of Judah finally begin to turn back. Zechariah, chapter 8, talks about those who turn back to God. But it takes all of that. But then they turn back. You return to the Lord your God and obey His voice according to all that I command you today, you and your children, with all your heart, with all your soul, that the Lord your God will bring you back. Okay, once that happens, once you finally turn, once your descendants turn, then the Lord will bring you back from captivity or from the exile. that is, being stripped off the land. He's going to bring you back from exile and have compassion on you and gather you again from all the nations where the Lord your God has scattered you. If any of you are driven out to the farthest parts under heaven, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there He will bring you. Then the Lord your God will bring you to the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it. He will prosper you and multiply you more than your fathers. And the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. And let's skip to verse 8. And you will again obey the voice of the Lord and do all His commandments, which I command you today. So, Israel was warned just before they entered the Promised Land that they were going to get kicked out of the Promised Land because they would not remain faithful. God knew it and told them up front. All right, chapter 2, Micah, verse 13. Final verse of chapter 2. New International has, one who breaks open the way, or simply translated in the Revised English Bible, the leader, or their leader. Their leader will go up before them. They will break through the gate and go out. Their king will pass through before them, the Lord at their head, or the Revised English Bible says, the Lord leading the way. At that future time, all of Israel will have righteous leadership. No longer will they languish under imperfect governments or authority figures who are influenced by carnal minds and human reasoning. It isn't going to happen any longer. Christ will be King of Kings at that time, and under Him, ruling all the tribes of Israel, those from the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom historically, will be the resurrected David. Let's notice this in Ezekiel chapter 37. Ezekiel 37 and beginning in verse 21. Then say to them, Thus says the Lord God, Surely I will take the children of Israel from among the nations, wherever they have gone, and will gather them from every side and bring them into their own land. Just as He said back in Deuteronomy chapter 30. This is when it's going to happen. Bring them back wherever they've gone. We'll gather them from every side, bring them into their own land, and I will make them one nation in the land, on the mountains of Israel. That is, literally, in the land of Israel. And one king shall be king over them all. They shall no longer be two nations, nor shall they ever be divided into two kingdoms again. They shall not defile themselves any more with their idols, nor with their detestable things, nor with any of their transgressions. But I will deliver them from all their dwelling places in which they have sinned, and will cleanse them. Then they shall be my people, and I will be their God. David my servant shall be king over them, and they shall all have one shepherd. They shall also walk in my judgments and observe my statutes and do them. And then we'll see in the next section where he explains this more fully, with Christ being in Jerusalem and David under his direction. So this closes the first of the three prophetic sections of Micah. Next time we will examine the second section.